Welcome to the Vision by Protiviti podcast. Today's edition is a special recording of a Vision by Protiviti webinar. Enjoy. Welcome to the Vision by Protiviti webinar, a new social contract, cultivating government for good in a rapidly changing world. I'm Joe Kornik, Editor-in-Chief of Vision by Protiviti, a global content resource examining big themes that will impact the C-suite and executive boardrooms worldwide. Over the last several months, we've been exploring the future of government, and I'm thrilled to be able to share with you some of what we learned so far, from e-government and the digitization of services, cybersecurity, data protection and privacy, to AI, emerging technologies, and the evolving nature of public-private partnerships. As you can probably imagine, challenges facing global governments are significant, and political unrest and geopolitical risk are omnipresent. In just a few minutes, we'll be digging into all of that using data from our exclusive Protiviti Oxford Executive Summary on the Future of Government survey, where we ask global business leaders to tell us what they expect from government and how it will impact their business over the next decade and beyond. But first, some housekeeping. Google Chrome or Microsoft Edge are the recommended browsers for today's event. If you're having trouble viewing the program, please log off and back on using one of those browsers. If you continue to have issues, please try refreshing your browser, and if that fails, message us in the Q&A box. Please also use that Q&A box to submit questions. We'll respond to as many of your questions as time permits at the end of the webinar. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand. There are materials we think you'll find valuable in the Resource Center, including Vision by Protiviti Future of Government content from all of our speakers today. So be sure to check that out when you have a free moment. For those seeking CPE credit, please answer at least 3 of the 5 polling questions that we'll be asking today and remain on the webinar for at least 50 minutes. If you meet that criteria for credit today, navigate to the Earn Certification window on your screen to download your certificate at the end of the webinar. We'll also provide a link to download a copy afterward. If you're not familiar with Vision by Protiviti, it's our global content initiative exploring how current megatrends will impact the future of business over the next decade and beyond. Since launching 2.5 years ago, we published nearly 200 articles, interviews, videos, and podcasts with visionaries, executives, academics, and subject matter experts who have some big ideas about big topics, such as the future of cities, work, ESG, sustainability, the metaverse, money, and now government. Please visit our site at vision.protiviti.com to explore all the content we've posted thus far, but specifically the future of government, including, as I mentioned, content by today's speakers. Those can be found in the Resource Center, along with a link to subscribe to Vision by Protiviti. Speaking of, I would encourage you to subscribe to join us on this journey and to begin receiving our bi-monthly newsletter highlighting all of our new content. And here's a sneak peek. Coming this fall, we'll be exploring the future of privacy. Subscribing is free and will unlock exclusive materials, including the full Executive Outlook report that we conducted with the University of Oxford. In just a minute, we'll dive into that data of the current report on the future of government, which was just released last week, so very timely. To help us dive into that data and more, we have outstanding speakers lined up for today. First up, we'll have Oxford's Dr. David Howard, the lead author of the report. He'll walk us through some of the key findings from the research that I just mentioned. Next, we're happy to have Kathleen Creighton, former Director of Cybersecurity for the U.S. Navy and former Rear Admiral, and she'll be joining Perry Keating, Managing Director and President of Protiviti Government Services, Cybersecurity and Privacy. As we speak right now, Perry is actually on stage at a conference, so we did record that conversation a few days ago. Perry also interviewed Kathleen as part of our Vision by Protiviti content, so be sure to check that out in our Resource Center as well. Finally, we're thrilled to have the World Bank's Ed Olowo-Okere, Senior Advisor and lead author of the World Bank's Future of Government report. Charles Dong, Protiviti's Global Public Sector Lead, was fortunate enough to interview Ed as part of the Vision by Protiviti content as well. You can find that Q&A in our Resource Center. Feel free to click any of the speaker bios for more information and to connect with any of them on LinkedIn. As you can imagine, I'll be asking our guests lots of questions today, but you don't get a free pass on answering any questions. It's time for our first poll question. That poll question is, what impact, if any, do you anticipate the government will have on your overall business success over the next decade? Extremely negative, somewhat negative, neither positive nor negative, neither positive nor negative, somewhat positive, or extremely positive. And it's just a reminder that you will perhaps need to scroll down to see all the responses. And please be sure to hit submit to register your selection. So we're going to be asking you 5 poll questions today. These are some of the same questions we asked in our very same survey. Just give it another minute or another few seconds before we publish the results and see what you had to say. Okay, looks like we've got a decent, almost all of you have answered the first question, so why don't we take a look at the results? So looks like we've got some negative, about half the audience actually is on this sort of the negative side. Not a whole lot extremely positive, some somewhat positive, and a little less than a third are sort of neither. Well, I can tell you that that's a bit different from our Oxford survey. Our business leaders were certainly a bit more optimistic. In this chart, you'll see we actually broke this down by geography here. So we're talking about the 3 different regions that we looked at: North America, Europe, and Asia Pacific. But in all, 50% of global business leaders were positive. Only 18% were negative, thought it'd be a negative impact, and about 32% said neither, so about a third. So I think some interesting responses there. We do have another poll question before we get into our first speaker, and that's, what level of involvement, if any, do you think government should have in correcting market failures caused by financial conditions through either regulation, taxation, subsidies, or incentives? And those responses are no involvement at all, little involvement, moderate involvement, substantial involvement, or extreme involvement. These questions, again, came directly from the Global Executive Survey that we conducted with Oxford. And again, you might have to scroll down to see all the responses, and please make sure you do hit submit so we can make sure that we register your result. Just give it another few seconds. We really do appreciate you taking a few minutes to answer these for us. I think we're probably okay to go ahead and publish the results here. So it looks like our moderate involvement is sort of leading the way. Little involvement, not a lot on the substantial or extreme involvement. Again, I can tell you that these answers do differ from our global business leaders that we took a look at. Here you'll get a chance to see what our global business leaders said when we asked them that same exact question. Significant was about 24%, substantial 30%, moderate about 33%, and little to no about 13% combined. So I think it's interesting. There is already a discrepancy I think we're seeing between our audience and our global business leaders. And who better to talk through some of those discrepancies and data findings with me than our first guest today. And that's Dr. David Howard from Oxford, a professor at Oxford University and lead author of the report. There's the cover of the report there, where we polled global executives about the future of government. Again, you'll get the full 30-page report with a free subscription to Vision. So David, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you and colleagues.
So David, some really interesting takeaways from this executive outlook on the future of government. Let's just start with an easy one. What was your biggest takeaway when you took a look at the data?
Well, I think it's the fact the very pro-government response across the board from global leaders, where the results have shown that, just under 90%, so 80% of global leaders believe the governments, their state government should have a direct role in supporting the economy. And we find this quite surprising in many ways, particularly in North America, where there's a consistent, over 2/3 across a variety of aspects of governance, where business leaders have really been very supportive of a significant engagement of the government in the economy. And I think this report is different from the others in that for those who read the other reports, we could say there were some standout figures. You know, there'll be certain percentages, stats that really spoke. This one, it's a consistency of support or pro-government response. So the report is 33 pages. There's 52 tables and figures for those who want to engage in it. And we actually kept those figures in because it's almost the attrition of support from moderate to very positive for government intervention, which was a great surprise. So that was our main takeaway. And I think it's quite a surprising report to go through. And I think there's been a question already about how many business leaders were interviewed. And there were 250 global business leaders from around the world, 40% in Asia Pacific, 40% in North America, and 20% in Europe, across a variety of industries and financial sectors, etc.
Right, and I should say those are telephone interviews actually, since we're interviewing C-level executives, CEOs of companies, board of directors. And David mentioned all the different reports that we've done. I should note that we have been with Oxford since we launched. So every one of those themes that we talked about, that I talked about in our intro, we have done an Oxford report with 3 professors from Oxford who've helped us out with all of these reports. So really interesting, and we're really incredibly proud of that relationship we have with Oxford and able to, to be able to bring you those types of research reports. Interesting, David, you mentioned just sort of how much global business leaders believed in government's ability to sort of move the needle in several different areas. The report points out that we're sort of in the midst of a super election year, right? In 2024, a year that will see more than 2 billion people in some 60 countries head to the polls and cast a ballot this year, more than a quarter of the world's population. So meanwhile, I feel like political and economic unrest has maybe put politics front and center when you combine that with the fact that so many people are going to the polls. Do you think perhaps that played a part in any of the results and the data that we saw, those 2 factors?
I think the notion, the super election year is clearly evident, as you say, 2 billion people in 60 countries are voting. But in some ways, that is a good media story. And so when an individual goes to the polls, I don't think they're often thinking about what's happening in another country. So I think one real takeaway from the super election year is, yes, there's a lot of elections occurring, but also we're in a stage now where there is more conflict in the world. And the sort of post-war peace dividend, if you will, that meant there was stability in many regions, obviously not all, after the Second World War, is suddenly fading. And as a recognition, actually, if you look at current conflicts, governments are playing a role in terms of trying to address these political and economic challenges in areas whereby businesses really can't engage. In some of the conflicts and stability we're facing today, it's the role of governments that are hopefully bringing a less risky environment, obviously, for individuals and businesses overall.
Right. One of those early poll questions that we even asked the audience, where we talk about the result, half of global business leaders say they expect government to have a positive impact on their business over the next decade. Only 18%, again, say they expect it to be negative, with about a third, the remaining third, saying it will sort of be neither positive nor negative. I thought that result was pretty promising. What do you make of it?
I think it's a very interesting and surprising result, yes. And again, you probably sometimes need to look at individual countries. So I think there's in some ways the national context is key. So let's look at the example of the UK. The experiment and result of Brexit has dramatically shaped the British economy. the signs of how it has actually impacted the economy, or should we say, varied. But I think that it definitely is a case of a wish for almost the government, a sensible government, to take back control. And in some cases, you can see where populist votes have maybe shifted the government's economic policy. In many cases, there's a recognition that actually we want to go back to sensible, so good governance per se. And I won't harp on about the UK example at all, but you can see after a period, almost a year, of very unstable forms of governance, there's a wish to have a more stable government of whatever political hue. And you can see in some ways, although you can see across the political spectrum, in many countries, there's been a rise of populism and to some extent the far right. In many cases, those political extremes are being moderated to try and present to the electorate a more centre-right, if you will, or at least some more moderate economic policies. So in some ways, that call for governance is a call for good governance, and in some ways less extreme, if you will, sensible, productive and pro-business type of governance. And as I think the report says, and I think you've already mentioned, some of the big pictures really need governments to come to the fore. And that's why I would argue that the majority of global leaders recognise some of the big issues can only be dealt with by effective and good governance.
Right, and I'm just going to touch on the geography earlier, because you mentioned how North America sort of across the entire survey pretty much outpaced its global counterparts in terms of its positivity towards government, which I found a little, just a little surprising. Any theories? It's sort of a notable trend. Any theories as to why that may be?
Well, I think when we first started discussing results, there was a genuine surprise. You know, that 2/3 of North American business leaders favoured higher state intervention. That 2/3 of North American leaders favoured engagement with the government in all aspects of the economy, in terms of labour regulation, actually almost favourably increased taxation to allow the government to provide better infrastructure, etc. And I think one of the differences why you could say there's a concentration in North America, 2/3 in favour as opposed to maybe 1/3 in particularly Asia Pacific. It might be the case that in many of the Asian Pacific countries there was already a high level of state regulation or intervention, and so maybe those structures were already in place, and so the idea of having more was seen to be less significant maybe for those business leaders. Whereas in other countries, in North America, to some extent in Europe, where businesses depend upon stable and reliable infrastructure, again, there's a recognition that that was really something the government really needed to provide, and therefore business was supportive of that form of government intervention in terms of economic stability, taxation, day-to-day infrastructure to make businesses work properly.
Right. Right. And business leaders, I mean, according to the survey, are looking to the government to sort of pull levers that help lead to a healthy economy, which would lead to a more positive business environment. 80% of our respondents expect government involvement in controlling economic growth or unemployment and inflation. And even more, 87% think government should have a role in correcting market failures caused by financial conditions. So do those results surprise you, and do you find them concerning at all?
I think just in general, as I said, the attrition of answers that pointed towards an expectation and almost a wish for greater governance intervention is as you said, it's one of the takeaway factors. Did it surprise me? I think if you look at the whole set of data, it's not a surprise because there's just one trend. So it's quite interesting how the road is pointing in all global regions to more like state intervention, but maybe government assistance to help economic growth. What I think maybe is probably of interest is we looked, we surveyed business leaders in a variety of, should we say, political contexts, from autocratic, if you will, to more democratic governments. And I think one of the key takeaways is, yes, there's a call for more, should we say, state intervention, government intervention, but it's an emphasis on good governance. So I think that's the key aspect here, that maybe it's not so much whether you're voting right or left or blue or green, etc. It's actually the business clearly want a form of governance that's going to be stable and provide that security, that infrastructure to make countries and economies work better.
Right. Well, David, I can't thank you enough for your help on the report, putting it together, and for your time today on the webinar, talking us through some of the findings. Really appreciate it. Again, as David said, the report is 33 pages. There's a lot in there to dig into, so we certainly would encourage you to log on to Vision, subscribe with an email, and download your copy of the report. David, thank you so much, and hang around for some audience Q&A at the end, would you?
Thank you very much indeed. Always a pleasure, Joe. Thank you.
Great. So I'm going to move right into our next poll question, our third question, which is, what level of involvement, if any, and we just talked about this, do you think government should play in regulating emerging technologies? This is what we're going to be getting into with our next speakers, such as AI and deep fakes. The results around this were, I think, pretty surprising. No involvement at all, little involvement, moderate, substantial, or extreme involvement. Again, you might need to scroll down a little bit to see all the results, and please make sure you hit submit when you do submit your question. Your responses. We wanted to ask people about these emerging technologies that everyone's talking about and find out what role we think the government should play, again, globally. And we break these numbers down by continent as well and geography. But if you could just let us know what you think. Give it another, few seconds. All right, why don't we go ahead and publish the results? Let's see. It looks like moderate involvement is pretty strong, substantial. And so between the three involvements, it looks like moderate is sort of the winner, with substantial and extreme coming in a little bit below moderate. And not surprisingly, no involvement or little involvement are pretty small. Let's take a look at what our business leaders had to say about this same question. And I think you'll find, again, that there's a bit of a disconnect, although perhaps not too much of a disconnect between what our business leaders said here, extreme 21%, substantial 31%, and moderate 20%. So not a whole lot of discrepancy here, which I think is interesting. Let's take a look at our next poll question before we get into our next speakers. And on this one, we're going to ask you, as government services are digitized, how concerned are you, if at all, about the government's ability to protect data in an e-government environment? This is a big one, right? Not concerned at all, a little concerned, somewhat, substantially, or extremely concerned about your government's ability to protect data as we move. I mean, government is digitizing its services. E-government is the wave. There are some places in the world that are doing it a lot more than others, but all are sort of on that track. We're all just sort of in different places on the track, but we will all be there eventually. The days of paper and PDFs and printed documents are clearly coming to an end. So let's take a look at those results as well. Somewhat concerned. Yeah, not surprising. We only have a few people that are not very concerned, but the vast majority of folks are more concerned. Let's take a quick look at our results from our survey. Here you'll see that we've got, again, pretty similar from what our survey responses said and what our business leaders said. So we really do appreciate you taking some time to answer those polls for us. And at this point, I'd like to bring in our next two speakers. Again, it's a video. It's Kathleen Creighton and Perry Keating. Up next, we're joined by Kathleen Creighton, former Director of Cybersecurity for the U.S. Navy, where she designed cybersecurity, IT, and cloud strategy, policy, and governance for 607,000 Navy personnel. Kathleen retired from the U.S. Navy in 2021, following a 33-year career, including 6 as a Rear Admiral. Currently, she's Independent Director for the Mantech Corporation, the West Bend Mutual Insurance Company, and the Military Women's Memorial. Kathleen, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Joe. Really excited to be here.
And I'm also joined by my Protiviti colleague, Perry Keating, Managing Director and President of Protiviti Government Services, Privacy and Cybersecurity, with over 30 years of doing business with the government. His experience gives him unique industry insight into the public sector, U.S. federal, state, and local, aerospace and defense, government contractors, defense industrial base, as well as the telecommunications and high-tech industries. Perry, thanks for being here today.
Thanks, Joe. Super excited to be here.
Well, thank both of you for doing this. We really appreciate it. We've got quite a bit of experience between the two of you, so what a wonderful and unique opportunity we have here today. We just heard some pretty interesting data points from our Future of Government survey that we conducted with the University of Oxford. One of the big takeaways is that 83% of global executives have concerns, and more than half have substantial concerns about the government's ability to protect citizens' data in a digitized environment. And extreme concerns were among basically North American executives had more concerns than the rest of the world. One, do those numbers surprise either of you? And two, are those concerns warranted?
So, Joe, the numbers don't surprise me, but I think they reflect just a kind of a general fear as people realize just how valuable data is to everyone, to individuals, to businesses, to government. And so that recognition, makes them concerned. But I would suggest that they really shouldn't just be concerned about the government protecting their data. They should be concerned about everybody who collects data. So everyone, your credit card company, your healthcare company, your insurance company, the cloud providers, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, everybody who stores data, you should be concerned about, and the government. So the government is mandated, to protect it. Industry, of course, wants to protect it because it could impact their business and their reputation. So I would say I'm not surprised at the general level of concern, but I would suggest that they shouldn't just be concerned about the government. They should be concerned about everyone who collects data.
Yeah, I think that's right. Nobody collects more data, right, than the U.S. and then the government, right? You think about the IRS or the Census Bureau or Social Security administrations who just have just so much data. So the numbers don't surprise me. But I completely agree with your idea that it's not only the government, it's other people, right? If you go back to, when one of the credit bureaus had a breach and, they had inquiries and they were like, I didn't even know the credit bureaus were collecting all of that information, right? And somewhere in the back of your car loan, it would say, oh, by the way, your credit information's going there. And then there was this sort of mass data loss, and there was a lot of people's data affected, and people didn't even know it was getting collected. So doesn't surprise me. The numbers are huge, and it's not just the government. It's folks that are collecting data that you don't even think about. All the people you mentioned, right, your phone carrier, certainly the discussion of TikTok and various social platforms as well. So doesn't surprise me. Probably warrants some concern and some good thoughts on how to protect your data are probably well warranted.
Thanks. Another data point centers on emerging technologies, right? More than 3/4, that's actually 81%, of business leaders say they expect emerging technologies, specifically AI, to transform the delivery of public services in the future. It's probably not surprising, but how do you see AI impacting the delivery of public sector services, government services, and how that impacts cybersecurity over the next several years?
So I think that AI brings great promise in the government's ability to provide citizen services, right? If we think about the civilian part of the government, a lot of that is citizen services, the Department of Transportation, the Department of Education, right? They're trying to provide services to the states and to the individuals. So I think how we're able to get those services, how we're able to interact with those services, how those services can be more customized to an individual or to a geography or to some sort of demographic, I think can make that experience better, quicker, faster, and more tailored. I think in some cases, right, it scares the hell out of you that says, right, we're all thinking of the Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, right? This sort of, AI is, machine on machine warfare, that sort of the defense and intel part of the world, you sort of go, holy moly, what does that turn into? So I think that part probably scares us some more. So I think, like many emerging technologies, you're like, hey, here's great hope, here's great, benefits, and then we flip the coin and go, and there's some big liabilities there. So sort of a yin and yang kind of thing, right?
I totally agree. It's interesting. I read a statistic that Accenture did a study, came up with that they believe that governments could save $500 billion between now and 2026, 2 years, through the use of AI for delivery of services. So clearly, we believe that there's something there in terms of automation, customer experience, making things more operationally efficient. So, huge promise. But we're going to have to do this thoughtfully, right? I mean, we're going to have to figure out train on it. You could get the tactics, techniques, and procedures, the governance. So there's a lot of work to be done. And I can tell you that at least, in DoD, there's no belief that they're going to allow, machine-on-machine warfare in any near future. But, I mean, just look at Ukraine. I mean, look at all the usage of drones. So, who would have thought that just a few years ago? Or we did know that a few years ago, but just the proliferation of autonomous systems. So it's coming, and I believe the best thing we can do is just start, be thoughtful, start using it, experiment, figure out how we can use it. Even things like, public safety. And one thing that really intrigues me is the idea of helping us write policy by, using the data we have, being able to, to mine, the analytics from it, figure out the trends and use that to write policy, and then, use it to figure out the response to that policy. So more to follow.
Right. It actually leads me, Kathleen, that leads me right into my next question, which is about the regulation of those technologies. In our survey, 53%, so a little bit more than half of global leaders believe government should play a substantial role in regulating technologies such as AI, and quantum was one of the examples we had put in the survey question. So what role do you think government should play in regulating emerging technologies?
I'll start there. I think that our government will not take a stance of, a blanket-wide set of policies. I think we're too big of a country, too big of an economy to do that, and I think that's correct. So I foresee a kind of a bottoms-up approach, maybe within each industry, with each sector, and an emergence of different regulations and private-public partnerships to figure out the right answers. And also, it's going to change because AI is going to change rapidly. So it's going to have to be fluid. But I think that's the way to able to ensure that we're still able to innovate and we get stagnant. But I mean, there'll be many people who are frustrated, who want, a big government, big brother, if you will, laying down the rules. But I don't think that would work in our country.
I think that's right? A single homogeneous across the board answer, I don't think is going to work. Because I agree with your premise that says for AI and quantum, it will mean very different things for very different industries, right? What it means in banking versus what it means in manufacturing versus what it means in, defense, I think will be very different. So I don't see how we'll have some large homogeneous, federal set of regulations that will apply to all. I don't know how that would work. I do think it will be tailored and customized depending upon which industry or which use or where you are on what that's going to that's going to look like. I do think if we somewhat look at a slightly different view, which is from a law enforcement standpoint, it's going to make the game a lot harder, right? I mean, if you're a bad guy and bad actor and you want to do certain things, it's going to be a lot harder to sort of figure out who you are and where you are and how I can either stop you from doing it or after the fact figure out how to clean it up. So it's certainly going to have some challenges, and probably one of the biggest ones is we're not sure what AI looks like and quantum looks like 10 years from now. So how do you write the regulation for you're not quite sure what it's going to look like? Certainly gives those of us in the policy business tough thought on how to respond and what's the most appropriate response. So I think we'll get it right, but we'll probably miss a couple of we'll get a couple of mistakes in till we get it figured out. So it'll be exciting for sure.
Yeah, following up on that, Perry, you mentioned bad actors, and I have to ask, I mean, these technologies can be and will be and probably are already being used right now to disrupt democracies and cause political unrest all over the world. Are governments ready for this future? And if not, how do they protect their national interest, their national security, as well as their citizens' interest and their citizens' privacy ultimately?
Yeah, so I think it's a really good question. So when I think of political unrest and nation state behavior around the world, I think there have been several times in history where you're like, this technology is going to solve whatever it is, right? The invention of whatever it is. And so I always go back to the concept of gaming theory, right? So if you thought about any sports team, you're like, as soon as a bad guy figures out a new game, then we got to figure out a new defense. And then as soon as we get a new defense that's so good, it forces them. So I think the idea that it's stagnant, I think has not changed in 5,000 years of world history, right? Bad guys have always done things. Good guys have always tried to figure it out, or figured out a way to counter it. And then, you sort of flip the game in the other direction. So I think what's really different in this case is speed, right? If you thought about, sort of the rate of change historically, it has gone at a certain pace. And I think now you're talking about things moving so fast that you actually find out about the breach after the breach has happened and all the data's gone. And so I think the speed becomes the tough part of sort of this new gaming back and forth, the rate of change and the speed at which the game's played, I think becomes sort of the new game.
Yeah, I concur, Perry. I think speed and capacity, right? So I don't think right now we're ready for the amount of disinformation that will be created, in society, in our country. I was watching the news last night, and there was a story about a school, high school principal in Maryland who had been suspended because the tape was found where he made racist and religious inappropriate comments, and he was suspended. And then there was an investigation done, and it turns out it was disinformation. It was AI was used with his voice to, make these statements, and he was exonerated. But it took months and months, right, to do this, to do this investigation and to find out. So, I mean, if this type of thing is happening all the time, we're going to need the capacity, like you said, the speed, and the tools that can, prove the veracity of the voice. This is Perry, Keating. This is Kathleen Creighton's voice, and so we're going to need capacity, and I don't think we have that in our government right now, in our law enforcement, and we're going to need to get it.
Yeah, and some of those are really good, right? I've seen some of the, the actors who are very concerned about their voice. They have a very distinctive kind of voice, and you've seen some of the stuff that's been created, and you're like, that's really good. Like, I'm not really sure whether that's Morgan Freeman or whether or not that's a make believe. And so, you know, they're so good. And again, you can just think if they could do that to a principal in Maryland, right? If you took the president and had him make some misquotes about the Middle East, right, could really set that into a turmoil, and we don't have months to undo it, right? It's people are going to react immediately. So yeah, it's a little bit, it's going to be a little bit scary. They're already really, really good, and you kind of wonder how much better they're going to get, right? Is this really Perry or is this really a recording, right? No doubt.
Exactly.
Right. Perry, I'm wondering right now if this is really you talking right now.
I know you could be dazzled. I could be lying on the beach drinking margaritas. So.
No, but in all seriousness, right? Deep fakes are a huge issue going forward, and it's scary to think about. So you've both been really generous with your time. I appreciate it. I just have one more final question from each of you. And that revolves around sort of the next 3 to 5 years, or maybe even take it out to the end of the decade. That's up to you. Optimism or pessimism? Do you think we'll get this right? I think that's such a key question, and we're all really, really curious to hear your answers.
Again, I'm a glass half full girl. I'm going to say that we will fail many times, but in the end, we will succeed enough to ensure, our economy and our national interests and our national security is preserved. But I would not be surprised if there are, numerous incidents where America stops and says, how have we let this happen to us? And critical infrastructure is to me is the big concern. So I think I'm overall optimistic, but I believe it's going to be a journey, and there are going to be failures along the way, and we're just going to have to, pick ourselves up, learn from our mistakes, and get better. But things are going to move fast, and we have to be ready and prepared to move fast, fight hurt, and learn from our mistakes.
So I'm a glass half full kind of girl as well. I think it may change other parts of the world. If I thought about Asia and I thought about Africa, even I thought about Europe, there's may be some real changes in the balance of power in those areas. I think when it comes to the U.S., right, the single easiest way for the have-nots to attack the haves, right, is through all of these technologies, right? I mean, armed invasion of the United States is probably not really a concept, right? But certainly being able to, from a cyber perspective, I think we'll have some days where we'll go, what in the world just happened? But I also think we will figure it out, and I think we will get it right, and I think we will be able to, protect our sovereignty and our financial well-being and our national security. But it's going to be an interesting item to see how well this goes, and I do think speed's going to be a big part of it, right? In terms of what that might look like. So.
Well, what a wonderful and insightful discussion. Thank you both for your insights. Thanks for being here today.
Our pleasure. Thank you, Joe.
Yeah, my pleasure. Glad to be here.
Thanks, Perry, and thanks, Kathleen, for that. We really appreciate it. We have one more poll question we'd like to ask you before we get to our time with the World Bank and Ed and his Future of Government report. That question is, how likely or unlikely is it that your business will collaborate or cooperate on a specific project or as part of a formal partnership with a government entity over the next decade? Extremely, somewhat, neither likely nor unlikely, somewhat likely, or extremely unlikely. Again, you might have to scroll down to see all the responses. Here we're really getting at the core of the public-private partnership and what that may look like. And we're going to be talking to Ed from the World Bank about that in just a few moments, or actually just a minute from now. So really excited to see what he has to say. We'll just give it another few minutes. I'm sorry, a few seconds to get a few more responses in before we go ahead and publish our results. Okay, let's go ahead and publish our results and see what we got. So it looks like pretty even split between somewhat unlikely and somewhat likely, with some sort of about 1 in 5 being somewhere in the middle. Actually, a pretty fair separation of answers here across the board. So a little different from what we saw in our survey. But now I would like to welcome in our next speaker, and it's the World Bank's Ed Olowo-Okere. Ed's the director of the World Bank's Future of Government report. We based a lot of our initial content off this report when we launched our Future of Government topic. It's a call to action for governments around the world to reinvent themselves as they face unprecedented health, economic, and fiscal challenges. Be sure to check out the Vision Q&A where I mentioned where Protiviti's Charles Dong talks to Ed. And we also have a copy of the Future of Government report from the World Bank in our Resources Center as well. So you should be sure to check that out as well. Ed, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure, Joe.
So Ed, the world, we just sort of heard a bunch from Perry and Kathleen about the world sort of where we are and sort of at an inflection point with 2 visions for the future. I know this was part of the World Bank's report. One builds on the progress governments have made to create a future focused on citizens, equity, and cohesion. The other involves increased uncertainty, inequality, poverty, and even suffering. So, Ed, we've been talking a lot about our data from that Oxford Protiviti survey. I just wanted to start off by getting a quick reaction to one of the data points from that survey. And that's nearly 6 in 10 global business leaders say it's likely their business will collaborate or cooperate on a specific project as part of a partnership with government. I think that's quite promising. What do you make of those numbers? 60% of executives think that they'll work with the government in the near future.
Absolutely, very promising, Joe. And one will expect that that number will even be higher in future. And why is that? One estimate puts the total SDG financing gap at about $4 trillion per annum through the year 2030. To meet that gap will require private sector financing. The governments just do not have that kind of money. Governments need to leverage the capabilities and resources of the private sector to do more with less while meeting the increasingly higher expectation of their citizens. So from my perspective, if governments choose to develop in-house capacity and mobilize resources to do everything that they need to do, then the result is going to be an increasingly bloated and inefficient public sector. So consequently, if you look at the report, the Future of Government report, which I know you've read very well, one of the 4 questions we posed is, how should government deliver? Okay. Right. This is really about how governments deliver social outcomes with available resources, but also with support from non-state actors like the private sector you just mentioned now, and then other actors like religious organizations, civil society organizations as well. And my conclusion is that as government thinks through this question, they will better appreciate the benefits of leveraging private sector's capabilities and financial resources, and that number will keep going up.
Right, and you mentioned the report, the World Bank report, so much to dig into there. A big section of it focuses on private-public partnerships. It's also a call to action for a new social contract between governments and citizens. That's what the World Bank is sort of calling for. What are the key elements to that new social contract? What should global governments be focused on?
Okay. Thanks, Joe. Let me just start by clarifying what we mean by a new social contract, or really, why do we need a new social contract? If we look across the countries, and I think one of the earlier speakers was referring to that, you will find that many people are dissatisfied with public services and the economic opportunities they have. You will also find conflicts in different regions of the world, and you will find various forms of polarizations in every country, whether it's political, religious, or other kind of polarization. You will also see angers being expressed through demonstrations and other ways due to dissatisfactions with the existing social contract. So that's why we need this new social contract. So to your question on what are the elements of this new social contract, it's really the same in terms of elements as the whole the existing social contract. It's really about what governments do for their citizens and what citizens do for their governments. Those are the two elements. Now, recognizing that governments face changing and growing demands from their citizens, a new social contract should be developed based on a re-examination of the two elements we just talked about, what governments do and what citizens do. And what we have advised in the Future of Government initiative is that government should focus on this re-examination by thinking through 4 key questions, and this will involve non-state actors in the process. So the first question is really, what is the role of government based on the key outcomes that citizens want to see? A second question is, how can government deliver, which I mentioned earlier on in my response to your first question. And then the third question is, how can government be more productive? And this is really about effectiveness and efficiency. And lastly, how can government build trust? And that involves having the new contract, delivering services that meet expectations, being accountable and transparent in the process of delivering services, and also managing factors that are outside the control of government but can affect trust, like the deep fake that you mentioned in your previous conversation.
Right. Ed, the report mentions that for a renewed social contract to be sort of sustainable and effective, it needs to be supported by what the World Bank calls an elite bargain. Can you describe that? What do you mean by an elite bargain?
Okay, thanks. As we know, the power, authority, and resources that enable governments to function are typically concentrated in the hands of the elites, not widely distributed among the broader society. So elite bargain is really about explicitly renegotiating the allocation of power, authority, and resources that enable governments to function so that governments can deliver on the new social contract. So it is worth mentioning that such a renegotiation will not necessarily be through a grand process. I mean, it's not like you call the elites and then you sit down and begin to have one conversation. It will most likely consist of small deals, a number of small deals that may take place in different sectors of the economy, different levels of governments, and in different regions. But the expectation is that in this process, the elites will commit to outcomes that benefit the broader society and not just themselves.
Right, and I know the World Bank believes in a broad range of sort of coalitions and teams outside of government will be critical to meeting these goals. How can these coalitions sort of come together? The private sector, higher ed, local groups, national associations, or global partnerships like the World Bank, for instance, cooperate and collaborate to bring about the necessary change that you're sort of arguing for?
So you're absolutely right that change is difficult, but ideally, governments will play the role of a convener to be able to build this coalition. And the government can begin that process by starting conversations within the government itself, with various institutions, levels of government, and also conversation with outside groups. like the communities, the civil society organizations, the private sector. So governments can build this coalition in different ways. For instance, with each group of stakeholders separately, or with a group of stakeholders depending on alignment of interests. I must also say that it is possible that non-state actors can come together as a coalition for change, and they can start the conversations among themselves and then put pressure on the government for transformation. Or you could have different groups coming together based on alignment of interest, like civil society organizations and communities, and then advocating for change and then collaborating with the government accordingly.
Right. Right. And governments, as we know, are often productive when it comes to developing policies and plans, but maybe less productive when it comes to implementation of those plans. So how can we make sure this future of government report is not just an aspirational document, but rather a playbook that will affect change?
Thanks. I must say that there is really no magic wand to ensuring that the future of government report will be used effectively. What we can do is to find ways to support the stakeholders to really get started and take the initial steps, okay, the conversations that I talk about, and then they can then begin to move along the process. But I think there are a few things we can do that might be helpful. First, creating an awareness that implementation is going to be challenging, as you mentioned, and that implementation will rarely goes according to plan, but that change can still be delivered. But that will require persistence and focus. So if we can create that awareness among the stakeholders, it will be helpful. Then another thing that will also be helpful is ensuring that the stakeholders are well prepared to be flexible, to learn and adapt along the process of making the transformation. And I must also say that we will need advocacy and support from all quarters. But from the World Bank side, we are well equipped to accompany governments in this process. For example, as you may notice on our website, we are developing a lot of tools to support the government to embark on this critical initiative.
Right. Thanks so much for that, Ed. We've got about 1 minute left, and I just want to ask you one more question. We laid out a lot of the challenges facing governments, and I know we're sort of at an inflection point. We talked about 2024 being sort of the super election year and a lot of the political unrest. We've got, wars raging on several continents. Last question for me, and that is, what does the government of the next decade and beyond look like? How optimistic are you that we'll be in a better situation, let's say in 2030 and going forward?
Yeah, I'm really optimistic. And the way I would describe the governments of the next decade will be a government that has reimagined its roles in service delivery and other roles that are also important, like regulation, which you discussed in the previous session. Also, the role of government in leadership coordination, that they will have re-examined that based on their capability, and also with the expectation to maximize the public sector, the private sector, and communities, so that they can all contribute to achieving the objectives of government. So essentially, we are talking of a government that has a clear vision of its role and is responsive to the demands of citizens. A government that delivers on its promises, a government that is innovative and productive, a government that does not pander to or enrich elites, a government that is trusted, prepared for crisis, a government that uses technology and leverages all the resources available in a country. Thank you.
And thank you, Ed. And look, I think I speak for everyone when I say I hope you're right, and I hope that governments pick up that report that the World Bank has put together, that roadmap for success, and really take it to heart, because I think it'll lead to a much better world for all the citizens on the planet. So thank you, Ed. Appreciate the time today. And thank you for joining us today. And thank you to all of our speakers who did such a wonderful job.
And thank you for listening to the Vision by Protiviti podcast. Please rate and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And be sure to visit vision.protiviti.com to view all of our latest content. Until next time, I'm Joe Kornik.